By the Middle Ages, nightmares had been explained as demons, witches, and spirits. But what if the culprit wasn't supernatural at all? What if it was something you ate? Because for centuries, physicians insisted that a bad dream was not caused by ghosts in the dark, but by cheese in your stomach. Before we continue, if you've been enjoying these journeys into the stranger side of history, I'd be grateful if you left a like or subscribed. It's a small gesture that helps keep these echoes alive long after the night has passed. Now, let's see what the doctors prescribed for your nightmares. The humors at war. In medieval medicine, the dominant theory was humoral balance. 4 fluids ruled the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. A nightmare, they believed, was caused by imbalance. Too much black bile, expect melancholy and dreadful visions. Too much yellow bile, fiery, violent nightmares. And if your stomach was overloaded, prepare for the sort of dream where demons come knocking. It sounds absurd today, but in an age without neuroscience, humors provided a system. Unfortunately, the system's main advice was usually, stop eating cabbage at midnight. Digestion and the demon of cheese, the connection between food and nightmares became so ingrained that even today, we joke about bad cheese dreams. This comes directly from centuries of physicians blaming heavy food for bad visions. Medieval texts warned against eating beans, pork, wine, and especially cheese before bed. Why? Because these foods were thought to release vapors that rose to the brain, clouding reason and stirring monsters in the mind. In other words, eat wisely, or risk summoning a demon made of dairy. Nightmares as a symptom of madness. As the Renaissance dawned, physicians began linking nightmares not only to digestion, but to mental disturbance. Disturbing dreams were sometimes seen as early signs of melancholy, mania, or even demonic possession disguised as madness. To dream of drowning, they said, meant too much phlegm. To dream of fire, too much bile. To dream of being crushed. Well, clearly, something had sat on you. The line between science and superstition blurred constantly, which was convenient, since it allowed doctors to always be half right. Remedies and prescriptions. Medieval and Renaissance medicine offered a colorful array of cures. Dietary restrictions: no beans, no pork, and definitely no midnight cheese. Herbal remedies: valerian, chamomile, and poppy extracts to calm the humors. Protective charms: yes, even physicians sometimes recommended amulets, because medicine is no match for a good placebo. Bloodletting: a cure-all for every ill. If you had nightmares, a barber might happily drain a pint. And, of course, prayer was often prescribed alongside medicine. Doctors may have worn robes instead of vestments, but both agreed the soul needed treatment as much as the stomach. The doctor will see you now. Imagine trudging to a physician after a week of night terrors, describing a hag crushing your chest. He frowns, strokes his beard, and gravely informs you, "Ah, yes. Clearly the work of last night's pork stew. My advice: bleed yourself, avoid cheese, and sleep on your left side." Not exactly cutting-edge care, but for centuries, this was the official medical stance on nightmares. Early glimpses of the modern view. Still, within the superstition, there were glimmers of truth. Some physicians noticed that nightmares grew more common during illness, stress, or grief. Others speculated that dreams reflected the hidden workings of the body. These observations laid early groundwork for later thinkers, Freud, Jung, and neurologists, who would eventually treat nightmares as more than spoiled dinner. But in the Middle Ages, the scientific journey was just beginning. For centuries, Nightmares were wedged uncomfortably between the supernatural and the medical. Were they demons? Were they witches? Or were they simply indigestion in disguise? The physicians of the medieval and Renaissance worlds tried to answer, often with more confidence than accuracy, but their fumbling attempts marked the beginning of a long transition. From nightmares as supernatural attacks to nightmares as biological mysteries. And as we'll see, once the doctors stepped aside, the artists stepped in, and nightmares became immortal on canvas. Nightmares don't just vanish with the dawn. They linger, clinging to memory, shaping the way we imagine the world. And for centuries, artists and writers have taken those night terrors and turned them into something permanent. A painting, a poem, a play. Nightmares transformed into culture. Fuseli's The Nightmare in 1781, the Swiss artist Henry Fuseli unveiled a painting simply titled The Nightmare. It shows a woman draped across a bed in twisted slumber, her body limp, her face contorted. Perched squarely on her chest is a squat, goblin-like creature, the incubus made flesh. Behind them, a ghostly horse pokes its head through a curtain, eyes white and bulging. Critics were scandalized. Was this art or indecency? But the public loved it. The image captured something everyone had felt but never seen, the crushing terror of the night made visible. Reproductions spread across Europe, and the nightmare became an icon. It was copied, parodied, even mocked, but never forgotten. It cemented the incubus and the chest-crushing hag as part of the cultural imagination. Shakespeare's haunted stage. A century earlier, Shakespeare had already laced his plays with nightmare imagery. In Hamlet, the prince wonders what dreams may come in death, perhaps terrors worse than life itself. In Macbeth, Lady Macbeth is plagued by visions that torment her sleep. What's done cannot be undone. To bed, to bed, to bed. Her guilt manifests as nightmare made permanent. And in Romeo and Juliet, Mercutio delivers the famous Queen Mab speech, a whimsical, eerie description of a fairy who meddles in dreams, delivering visions both sweet and sinister. For Shakespeare, nightmares weren't random, they were consequences. Guilt, ambition, madness, all found their stage in the darkness behind the eyelids. Dante's Inferno. Going further back, Dante Alighieri's Inferno, early 14th century, reads less like a theological treatise and more like one very long, elaborate nightmare. The poem is a descent into hell's dreamscape. Monsters, grotesque punishments, landscapes that twist logic and terror alike. Dante wakes repeatedly, trembling from visions of horror, only to plunge deeper. For readers of the time, the poem blurred dream and reality. Was this imagination or prophecy? A fever vision or divine revelation? The ambiguity made it all the more terrifying. Nightmares on the page by the 18th and 19th centuries. The Gothic novel was in full bloom, and nightmares were at its heart. Authors like Mary Shelley, writing Frankenstein, admitted that the central image of the creature came to her in a waking dream, half vision, half nightmare. Edgar Allan Poe filled his tales with dreamlike horrors, haunted chambers, premature burials, grotesque visions of death. Nightmares gave Gothic fiction its power. These weren't polite moral tales, they were feverish hallucinations, spilled onto the page. Goya's The Sleep of Reason produces monsters in Spain. The artist Francisco Goya engraved perhaps the most famous nightmare image. After Fuseli, The Sleep of Reason produces monsters, 1799. It shows a man collapsed on his desk, asleep, while night creatures swarm around him. Bats, owls, cats, all symbols of irrational fear. The meaning was clear. When reason sleeps, nightmares rise. But was Goya condemning superstition? Or was he admitting that reason itself could never protect us from the creatures in our heads? The ambiguity made it powerful. Surrealists and dreams. By the 20th century, artists no longer just depicted nightmares, they mined them. The surrealists, Dali, Magritte, Ernst, treated dreams as raw material, melting clocks, impossible landscapes, distorted figures, nightmare as art form. Himself claimed his images came directly from dreams, bizarre and terrifying in equal measure. Nightmares were no longer shameful or superstitious. They were fuel. The art critic's nightmare, of course. Not everyone loved it. Critics sneered at Fuseli's nightmare, calling it vulgar. Others dismissed Gothic fiction as trash designed to corrupt young women. Imagine being so offended by art that your nightmare is other people reading novels. And yet, that was the fear. That to look too closely at these images and stories was to invite nightmares into the waking world. If true, then, judging by today's horror section on Netflix, we've invited plenty. From Dante's visions to Fuseli's incubus, from Lady Macbeth's guilty sleep to dreamscapes. Nightmares have haunted art and literature for centuries. They gave form to the formless, turning midnight terror into something that could be painted, performed, or read aloud. Nightmares are fleeting, but culture makes them permanent. And once captured, they no longer belong to the dreamer. They belong to us all. By the 19th century, the world was changing. The age of demons and witches was giving way to the age of science. But the nightmare didn't disappear. Instead, it slipped into a new disguise. The intruder in the night was no longer a hag or an incubus. It was your own mind. Freud, nightmares as wish fulfillment. Enter Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis. In 1900, he published The Interpretation of Dreams, and with it, nightmares received their first modern diagnosis. Freud believed dreams, even the terrifying ones, were expressions of unconscious desires. Yes, even nightmares. That monster chasing you through the woods. A repressed wish in symbolic clothing. For many readers, this was revolutionary. For others, it was insulting. After all, nobody wanted to be told that their nightmare about being strangled by a shadow was secretly about wanting to strangle their father. Freud, however, was undeterred. Nightmares weren't invaders. They were confessions. Ones you hadn't agreed to make. Archetypes. In the dark, Freud's student, Carl Jung, took a different path. For him, nightmares weren't just personal. They tapped into a collective unconscious. Symbols and archetypes shared by all humanity. The monster in your dream wasn't just your monster. It was the monster, an echo of every culture's fear given shape in your mind. Where Freud saw sexual repression, Jung saw mythology. The incubus, the hag, the shadow, all recurring figures of the collective human nightmare. It was less embarrassing, perhaps, but no less terrifying. Recurring nightmares as psychology took root. Physicians and analysts began to record case studies of patients plagued by recurring nightmares. Soldiers returned from wars with the same visions: falling shells, gas attacks, comrades dying again and again. Nightmares were no longer omens or curses. They were symptoms of trauma, of illness, of stress. And yet, the language often remained haunted. Doctors still described specters, phantoms, and haunting images. Even with new science, the old metaphors clung stubbornly to the edge of the bed. War and the nightmare. The First and Second World Wars produced a flood of nightmare accounts. Shell shock and later PTSD were defined not only by waking terror, but by night terrors. Men described being dragged back to the trenches each night, reliving battles in endless cycles. Their nightmares were so vivid that doctors noted physical symptoms: sweating, screaming, even injuries from thrashing in bed. Nightmares had become part of the medical file. They were no longer supernatural crimes. They were clinical evidence. Freud at a dinner party. One can imagine the awkwardness of Freud at a polite dinner party. Someone confesses, "I keep dreaming of being chased by wolves." Freud nods gravely, strokes his beard, and says, "Ah yes, clearly you're repressing forbidden desires. Not exactly the reassurance you want before dessert." Dreams as diagnosis. Despite the mockery, Freud and Jung cracked open a door. Nightmares were not messages from the gods, nor just indigestion. They were part of the psyche, the mind talking to itself, whether we wanted to hear it or not. Psychologists began to catalogue them, looking for patterns. Nightmares became diagnostic tools, revealing stress, trauma, or illness long before other symptoms appeared. For the first time, the nightmare wasn't just a curiosity, it was evidence. With psychology, the nightmare shifted once more. No longer a demon, no longer spoiled cheese. Now, it was the shadow of the self. Freud made it personal, Jung made it universal, and soldiers returning from war made it tragically real. The nightmare had finally entered the clinic. But though the explanations grew more sophisticated, the experience itself remained unchanged. To wake in terror, hearts pounding, lungs straining, that was as old as humanity. And perhaps the cruelest irony of all, once you closed your eyes, even science couldn't protect you. If you've been enjoying this journey through the haunted history of the night, consider leaving a like or subscribing. It helps keep these echoes alive, and ensures that when the next nightmare comes, at least you won't be facing it alone.